Amelia Vance was 27 years old, held a master's degree in child psychology from the University of Chicago, and she was scrubbing dried pasta sauce off plates in a restaurant kitchen at 2 in the morning because no clinic in the state of Illinois would hire her anymore. 8 months ago, she'd blown the whistle on her own boss, a man who'd been overprescribing sedatives to children for kickbacks, and in return, he'd destroyed her reputation so thoroughly that her name had become a blacklist entry in every pediatric practice, from Chicago to Springfield. She had $87,000 in student debt, a 30-day eviction notice taped to her apartment door in South Side, and exactly $14 left in her checking account when her phone buzzed with an email that would change everything. Private family Sikhs live in nanny. $10,000 per month. Requirements: advanced degree in child psychology, experience with childhood trauma, immediate start. She didn't know the family's name yet. She didn't know that the address on Astor Street belonged to a 4-story French limestone mansion hidden behind 10-foot iron gates and surveillance cameras that tracked every moving thing within 300 feet. She didn't know that the man waiting inside had built an empire of hotels and casinos and real estate that the FBI had been trying to crack open for 15 years. And she certainly didn't know that his 5-year-old daughter hadn't spoken a single word or eaten a real meal in 9 months since the night her mother died in a car crash that wasn't really a crash at all. All Amelia knew was that she couldn't afford to say no. What she'd find behind those gates would be far more dangerous than poverty. A little girl drowning in a secret too heavy for her tiny body, a man powerful enough to erase people who inconvenienced him, and a truth buried so deep that uncovering it would put a target on Amelia's back and force her to confront the one thing she'd spent 21 years running from, the night she lost her own parents to the very same kind of violence that lived inside those walls. If this story grabs your heart, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to the moment Amelia Vance stood outside those iron gates, adjusted the only blazer she owned, a $12 clearance rack find with a loose thread on the left cuff, and pressed the doorbell that would open the door to the most terrifying and beautiful chapter of her life. The iron gate opened with a low, scraping groan of metal, and 2 men stepped out of the darkness behind the stone pillars. They weren't dressed in ordinary security uniforms. They wore black suits tailored closely enough to hide the guns beneath their arms, and their eyes swept over Amelia from head to toe with the kind of look she had seen in people trained to assess a threat within 3 seconds. No one said a word. The taller man nodded toward the stone path leading into the mansion, and Amelia walked forward, feeling both of their gazes burning into her back with every step. The path stretched through a garden trimmed so perfectly that every rosebush and every green hedge looked as though it would be replaced immediately if it dared grow even 1 centimeter out of line, and Amelia thought this garden hadn't been planted to be beautiful. It had been planted to control. The front door of the mansion opened before she could knock. The woman standing behind it was Nina Ortiz, 55 years old, with a serious face marked by the deep lines at the corners of the mouth of someone who had kept secrets for too long. But her dark brown eyes were warmer than anything Amelia had felt since stepping through the iron gate. "Mr. Mercer is waiting for you in the library," Nina said in an even voice, though every word was chosen carefully. "He doesn't like waiting. In truth, no one here likes making him wait." Amelia stepped into the main hall, and it took her a full 3 seconds for her mind to process what her eyes were seeing. The floor was black Marquina marble, imported from Spain. The kind of stone she had once seen in an architecture magazine in the waiting room of her dentist's office. The kind of stone where each slab cost as much as 6 months of rent for her studio apartment on the South Side. A baccarat chandelier hung in the center of a ceiling, 7 meters high, hundreds of French crystals reflecting the light into tiny, shimmering flecks across the walls, and Amelia knew that chandelier cost around $150,000 because she had once read about it in an article titled, "Things You'll Never Be Able to Afford." Her old sneakers, the pair she had worn for 3 years and glued the soles back onto twice with superglue, let out a faint squeak against the polished stone every time she stepped, and in the vast silence of the hall, silent as a church, each one echoed like a reminder she didn't need anyone to say aloud that she didn't belong here. On the wall hung a painting Amelia recognized at once, not because she knew art, but because she had studied it in cognitive psychology. Figure with Meat, by Francis Bacon. 2 sides of beef hanging beside the figure of a man seated in a chair, a work about power and decay, whose value was enough to buy the entire row of houses where she lived. She wondered whether the man who owned this house had chosen the painting for its beauty or for its message. Nina led her down a long corridor, and Amelia began to count. 2 more bodyguards stood at the corner of the first-floor hallway. Another sat in front of a surveillance screen in the room to the right. The door left open just enough for her to catch a glimpse of 12 small monitors, showing camera feeds from all over the property. Another man walked past in the opposite direction, nodding to Nina but looking at Amelia as though committing her face to memory. 5 bodyguards on the first floor alone of a house in Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood. This wasn't the home of a wealthy businessman. This was the fortress of a man who had enemies. And those enemies were dangerous enough that he needed a small army guarding him even in his sleep. Amelia felt her chest tighten. Not from fear. She had lived through things far more frightening than a house full of armed men, but from the sudden understanding that whatever happened beyond the library door ahead wouldn't be as simple as a nanny job. Nina stopped in front of a heavy oak door, turned to Amelia, and spoke so softly that it was almost meant for her ears alone. A free piece of advice, girl. Don't say more than necessary. Don't ask about anything that doesn't concern the work. And never, absolutely never, mention his wife. Before Amelia could ask why, Nina had already knocked twice, short and precise, and pushed the door open, revealing the library beyond, where Ashton Mercer stood beside the window with his back turned, looking out over the unnervingly perfect garden below. Ashton Mercer turned from the window, and Amelia saw him clearly for the first time. 36 years old, yet he looked like a man who had lived twice that number of years, not because of wrinkles or gray hair, but because of his eyes, a pale gray, cold as unpolished steel, the kind of eyes that looked through a person rather than at them. His jaw was cut in angles as sharp as a blade, and when the light from the window fell across him at a slant, Amelia noticed the long scar running across the back of his right hand, from the knuckle of his index finger down toward the wrist, the kind of scar that didn't come from a kitchen accident or a bicycle fall, but from something she knew she shouldn't ask about. He was wearing a custom-made Keaton suit, the kind of fabric Amelia knew cost at least $25,000 apiece, because she had once been forced to look up gift prices for VIP clients at the restaurant where she washed dishes. But the way Ashton Mercer wore that suit wasn't like a businessman heading into a meeting. He wore it like armor, like the final shell between himself and the rest of the world. He didn't shake her hand. He didn't invite her to sit. He didn't ask whether her trip had gone smoothly. The first thing he said to Amelia Vance was, "Have you read the non-disclosure agreement?" Amelia nodded. All 47 pages. Ashton tilted his head slightly, and Amelia realized that was the closest thing to surprise this man allowed himself to show. "Then you know that if any information about my family leaves this house, the penalty is $500,000, along with other consequences the contract doesn't list. But I assure you, you wouldn't want to know them." He said it in the same calm tone someone might use to read the morning weather, and it was that calmness that made Amelia feel colder than any threat she had ever heard. Amelia said nothing. She only kept her eyes fixed on his, and she noticed something flicker across Ashton's face, so quickly that she almost thought she had imagined it, as though he were reassessing her, placing her into a different category in his mind from the one he had chosen at first. "Sit down." It wasn't an invitation. It was an order. Amelia sat in the leather chair across from the desk, and Ashton remained standing, a deliberate choice to make sure he was always looking down at anyone seated in this room. "My daughter's name is Rosalie," he said, and for the first time Amelia heard something in his voice shift, not softer, not warmer, but heavier, as if that name were a weight he had to brace himself to lift each time he spoke it. "She is 5 years old. 9 months ago, her mother died." Rosalie stopped speaking. Completely. Not a single word since then. Ashton walked to the bookshelf, pulled out a thick file, and placed it on the desk in front of Amelia. "She also refuses to eat almost everything. She only drinks milk and eats a few bites of white bread, enough to keep her out of the hospital, but not enough to call it living." Amelia opened the file. Inside were reports from 7 of the top child psychologists in America: Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, Columbia Presbyterian, names every psychology student dreams of interning with, never mind being invited to consult. Each report ran for dozens of pages, full of technical language and testing, and every one of them ended with the same conclusion. No specific cause identified. Continued monitoring recommended. 7 of the best doctors in the country, and none of them understands why my daughter won't open her mouth. Ashton said it not with desperation, but with a cold fury. the kind of fury that belongs to a man accustomed to money buying everything, only to discover for the first time that it can't. Then there is the matter of the nannies, he continued without waiting for Amelia to respond. 9 in 9 months. All of them experienced, educated, with recommendation letters from families whose names you would recognize if I said them. All of them gave up. Why? Amelia asked, and she kept her voice steady even though something inside her chest was tightening. Because Rosalie isn't only silent, Ashton said. He looked directly into Amelia's eyes, and she realized that beneath that cold steel there was something breaking very slowly and very deeply. She is silent in a way that makes adults feel as though they are doing something wrong. She looks at them with eyes older than her age, and they can't bear it. The last nanny lasted 11 days. She cried as she walked out the door and told me she would rather care for a child with severe autism than have to look into Rosalie's eyes for one more day. Ashton stopped, and in that stretch of silence, Amelia heard the thing he didn't say, but that rang louder than every spoken word, that this man, the man the FBI had tracked for 15 years, the man all of Chicago knew better than to provoke, was watching his daughter die by inches every day and was completely powerless. "Do you still want the job?" Ashton asked. "Or would you like me to call a car to take you home?" Amelia closed the file, set it down on the desk, and said in the calmest voice she could manage, "I want to meet Rosalie." Ashton said nothing. He simply rose and walked out of the library, and Amelia understood that this was how he said "follow me" without needing to open his mouth. They climbed the main staircase, past the second floor where Amelia caught sight of 2 more bodyguards standing at either end of the hallway, then continued up to the 3rd floor, where the air changed completely. The lower floors were marble and crystal and power. The 3rd floor was silence. The kind of silence that doesn't belong to peace, but to something that died a long time ago and hasn't yet been cleared away. Family photographs lined the 3rd floor hallway, and Amelia noticed what was wrong the moment her first step touched the wooden floor. Every photograph sat in an expensive silver frame, professionally taken, but every 3 or 4 pictures there was one turned face down, the glass pressed to the wall so that only the wooden back of the frame could be seen. Amelia counted 7 overturned frames as they walked the corridor, and she didn't need anyone to explain for her to understand that all the hidden photographs had one person in common, the woman Nina had warned her never to mention. Colette Mercer wasn't only dead, she had been erased from these walls, but not out of indifference. It was something far worse, a grief so large that even seeing her face couldn't be endured. Ashton stopped at the last door in the hallway. Butterfly stickers were pasted across it, the kind any 5-year-old child would have chosen, but most of them were nearly peeled away now, the corners of the wings curling up, the colors faded, and no one had bothered to replace them. As though the room behind this door had been frozen at the moment of 9 months ago, and everything inside had been slowly decaying ever since. Ashton put his hand on the doorknob but didn't open it right away. He stood still for 3 seconds, and Amelia realized this wasn't the hesitation of a polite man. It was the preparation of a man about to step into a place that hurt him every single time he entered it. "Rosalie," Ashton said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper, and for the first time Amelia heard tenderness in it, fragile and awkward, as though he were holding something breakable, with hands that were only used to crushing things. "Papa's coming in to see you, sweetheart. There's someone new here to visit you." Silence on the other side. Not a sound. No footsteps. No creak of the bed. Ashton opened the door. The room was as large as the entire studio apartment Amelia was renting on the south side, but it didn't feel spacious at all. If anything, it made everything inside seem smaller, especially the child. Rosalie Mercer sat in the farthest corner of a king-size bed, her knees drawn up to her chest, both arms wrapped tightly around a lavender silk scarf worn thin at the edges from being held too long and too tightly. Amelia felt something in her chest do more than tighten. It broke open, slowly and deeply, when she saw that child. 5 years old, but looking 3. Her collarbones jutted sharply beneath a pale pink nightgown hanging loose over a body so thin it barely seemed to fill the fabric. Her face was tiny, with unusually large green eyes, and those eyes looked at Amelia with an expression no 5-year-old in this world should ever know, the gaze of a small animal that had been hurt too many times and was now only waiting for the next wound. Amelia didn't walk straight to the bed. She stopped in the middle of the room, lowered herself slowly until both knees touched the floor, placing herself lower than Rosalie, level with the child's eyes, and she spoke in the gentlest voice she had. "Hello, Rosalie. My name is Amelia. I won't make you say anything. I'll just sit here. Is that all right? Rosalie didn't nod, didn't shake her head, didn't react in any measurable way, but she also didn't retreat farther into the corner of the bed, didn't hide her face in the silk scarf, didn't turn away. And Amelia, who had spent 6 years learning how to read the body language of traumatized children, knew that for a child like Rosalie, not to pull back from a stranger was a signal bigger than any spoken word. Amelia sat still on the floor, not moving closer, not saying anything more, letting her presence become something familiar inside the silent room. And while she waited, her eyes moved across every detail. On the bedside table beside Rosalie were 9 sheets of drawing paper stacked together, the thick kind used for crayons, and from where she sat on the floor, Amelia could see at an angle the rough marks on the top page. She didn't reach for them, but her eyes had already registered enough. 9 drawings. And on the one she could see most clearly, a woman with long blonde hair was high above the ground, and below was the earth. And that woman wasn't standing, wasn't sitting, wasn't lying down. That woman was falling. Amelia's trained mind processed the information within 2 seconds. Colette Mercer died in a car accident. A car accident means a side impact, a rollover, a loss of control. It doesn't include an element of falling from a height, but this child drew her mother falling, not once, but perhaps as many as 9 times. 9 drawings with the same theme, the obsessive repetition that anyone who had studied childhood trauma psychology would recognize as the sign of a memory caught in place, a memory the child couldn't speak aloud, and so had to pour out in images. Amelia kept her face completely calm, but inside her mind everything was rearranging itself, pieces sliding into place, the very pieces 7 of the top doctors in America might have missed, because they had been searching for pathology when the answer lay somewhere else entirely. This child wasn't mute because of ordinary psychological trauma. This child was holding something back, something she had seen or heard, something she believed would bring something terrible down on her if she ever spoke it aloud. Rosalie Mercer hadn't lost her voice. Rosalie Mercer was choosing silence, and the reason she was choosing silence might be more dangerous than anyone in this house wanted to admit. Amelia sat on the floor of Rosalie's room for nearly 20 minutes without saying another word, simply letting the rhythm of her breathing become a natural part of the room, the way she had been taught in the 2nd year of her master's program, that traumatized children don't need words. They need a presence that doesn't threaten them, a patience with no expiration date. Rosalie still sat in the corner of the bed, clutching the lavender silk scarf. But in those 20 minutes, Amelia noticed a small change so slight that most adults would have missed it. The child's body gradually became less rigid, her shoulders lowered by a few millimeters. Her breathing shifted from shallow and fast to a little slower. Not much, but enough. Amelia rose slowly to her feet, careful not to make any sudden movement, and said softly, "Rosalie, I have to step outside and talk to your papai for a moment. I'll come back if you want me to." She walked toward the door, and just as her hand touched the knob, the sound came. So small it was almost swallowed by the thick silence of the room, hoarse from 9 months of disuse, trembling like a thread about to snap, yet unmistakably a human voice, unmistakably English, unmistakably the words of a 5-year-old child speaking for the first time since the night her mother died. "Don't go. Everyone always goes." Amelia stopped, her hand still on the doorknob, and she didn't turn around at once because she knew that if she turned with any strong reaction, any expression of shock or excessive emotion, she would frighten Rosalie, and the child would shut down again immediately. Instead, she only turned her head slowly over her shoulder, gave a faint smile, and said in the most ordinary voice she could manage, "I'm not going anywhere, Rosalie. I'm right outside the door." Then she stepped into the hallway and closed the door very gently behind her. Ashton was standing just outside. His back rested against the opposite wall, his arms hanging at his sides, but his hands were clenched into fists so tightly that the knuckles had gone white. And Amelia saw his eyes, those cold steel-gray eyes that 20 minutes earlier had looked at her the way a man looked at an applicant file, now red around the lower rims, not filled with tears because perhaps this man's body had forgotten how to cry long ago, but red enough for Amelia to understand that he had been standing here with his back against the wall, hearing his daughter's voice for the first time in 9 months, through the thin wooden door, and what he had heard was his little girl begging a stranger not to leave because everyone in her short life had always left. No one spoke for 10 seconds. Amelia let that moment exist because she knew Ashton needed it. Needed time to force everything he was feeling back down beneath the layer of steel he used to face the world. When he finally opened his mouth, his voice was cold again, but Amelia could hear the crack beneath it. "What do you think?" Amelia chose her words carefully. "Rosalie doesn't have any of the psychological conditions those 7 doctors diagnosed. Ordinary trauma-related selective mutism doesn't create this kind of silence." Ashton frowned. "What kind of silence?" "Your daughter hasn't lost the ability to speak. She is choosing not to speak. There is a very big difference between those two things." Ashton pushed himself away from the wall and stood straight, and Amelia realized he was trying to process the information in the only way he knew, by analyzing it like a business deal. Why would a 5-year-old child choose not to speak? Amelia looked directly into his eyes. Because she is keeping a secret, and that secret is killing her from the inside. Mr. Mercer. She can't eat because her body is carrying a burden that even adults would struggle to endure, and the only way she knows how to control it is to shut everything down. Her mouth won't speak, her stomach won't receive, her body curls into the smallest ball it can make, because she believes that the smaller she becomes, the less she will be seen, and the less she is seen, the safer she will be. The silence that followed was very long. Amelia realized Ashton wasn't thinking. He was fighting, between the human part of him that wanted to believe her and the boss inside him who trusted no one. 2 weeks, he said at last. You have 2 weeks. If within 2 weeks Rosalie can speak 1 complete sentence and eat 1 full meal, you stay. If not, you leave this house and forget everything you have seen here. Everything. Amelia didn't blink. I don't need 2 weeks to know she can be helped, but I do need 2 weeks to prove it to you. Ashton didn't answer. He only turned and walked toward the staircase, leaving Amelia standing alone in the 3rd-floor hallway with 7 overturned photographs and a door covered in peeling butterfly stickers, and behind that door was a 5-year-old child who had opened her mouth for the first time in 9 months, for one reason only, to ask her not to leave. Amelia placed her hand against the door, not opening it, only resting it there, and said softly enough for only herself and the door to hear, "I'm not going anywhere, Rosalie." The next morning, before Rosalie woke up, Amelia went downstairs to the kitchen to find Nina. The housekeeper was making coffee in an industrial kitchen as large as Amelia's apartment, and when she saw her walk in, Nina simply poured an extra cup without asking and placed it in front of Amelia as though she had been expecting this conversation. Amelia asked, "Mrs. Ortiz, before Mrs. Collette died, what did Rosalie's breakfast look like?" Nina set the coffee pot down and fell silent for a few seconds, the kind of silence that belongs to someone choosing between loyalty to her employer and loyalty to the child she had watched wither away for 9 months. Then she spoke. Every Sunday morning, Mrs. Collette got up at 6, before Rosalie did, and made pancakes. Not ordinary pancakes. She had butterfly molds. She poured the batter into them and cooked them into little butterflies, then dusted powdered sugar over the wings so they looked like butterfly dust. Rosalie called them snow butterflies. Every Sunday, never once missing, she sat in the high chair in this kitchen and waited for her mother to finish, and then the 2 of them clapped 3 times before eating. Amelia asked what 3 claps meant. Nina drew in a long breath. "Mama loves you." That was their secret language. They clapped 3 times instead of saying it out loud because Rosalie used to get shy when other people were in the kitchen. Amelia memorized every detail, not using a notebook because she knew that if Ashton or anyone else in the house saw her writing things down, they would become suspicious immediately. And the last meal before Mrs. Collette died, Amelia asked next. Nina turned her face toward the kitchen window. Bow tie pasta. Red tomato sauce made from fresh tomatoes in the garden. Rosalie loved that pasta because she said they looked like butterfly bows. That day she ate 2 full plates. 2 days later, Mrs. Collette died, and Rosalie never ate pasta again, never ate anything red again. Amelia understood at once. Red tomato sauce, blood, death, all of it had fused together in the mind of a 5-year-old child into one single mass. Amelia asked Nina to show her the meal plan the doctors had prescribed for Rosalie. Nina opened a drawer and took out 3 folded sheets of paper, and when Amelia read through them, she had to stop herself from shaking her head. Unsweetened oatmeal, steamed chicken with no seasoning, boiled vegetables with no salt, liquid vitamins with a medicinal taste. Everything was brought upstairs to the bedroom on a tray, eaten alone, on the bed, beside a small bowl placed there in case she vomited. Amelia looked at the paper and saw not a nutritional plan, but a perfect blueprint for making a traumatized child hate food more with every passing day. Food without color, without smell, without memory, without joy, eaten in the bedroom where everyone had already expected her to vomit, alone. Everything had to change. Amelia spent her first morning not beside Rosalie. She went out into the garden behind the mansion, where the housekeeper said no one had gone since Colette died, and found a corner beneath an old oak tree where sunlight came through the leaves in dancing flecks across the grass. She set up a small table and 2 chairs, spread out a checkered tablecloth, placed a jar of wild daisies picked from the garden, and turned that corner into something that looked nothing like a sick room or a bedroom. When Amelia led Rosalie out into the garden at midday, the child didn't resist, but she didn't look eager either. She simply followed with the lavender scarf draped over her shoulder, and her green eyes scanning everything with caution. Amelia didn't place food in front of Rosalie. Instead, she set out ingredients: a ripe avocado, a small container of soft cheese, a few slices of bread, and a dull butter knife, safe for children. Amelia cut open the avocado and let Rosalie look at it, smell it, touch it. "Do you want to try squeezing it? Just for fun. You don't have to eat it." Rosalie stared at the avocado for 15 seconds, then reached out one finger and touched it, then squeezed lightly, then squeezed harder, and the ripe avocado spilled through the spaces between her fingers, and for the first time since Amelia had met her, the corner of Rosalie's mouth twitched slightly. Not a smile, but the ghost of a smile, a muscular memory her body still held even though her mind had forgotten how to make it happen. On the second day, Amelia led Rosalie into the kitchen, the place Nina said the child hadn't stepped into since her mother died. Rosalie stopped in the kitchen doorway, her feet close together, her eyes fixed inside with an expression Amelia recognized as longing mixed with fear. Amelia didn't pull and didn't push. She simply sat down right on the threshold and began telling a story, quietly enough that Rosalie would have to come closer if she wanted to hear it. Once upon a time, there was a little butterfly princess. The princess had silver wings and flew all over the world. Everywhere she went, she found a food with a different kind of power. Rosalie stepped across the kitchen threshold without seeming to realize that she had done it. She stood beside Amelia, still hugging the lavender scarf, and listened. Amelia continued the story while her hands mixed the pancake batter, pouring it into the butterfly mold she had asked Nina to find in a kitchen drawer the night before. When the first butterfly pancake was turned over, golden and fragrant with butter, Rosalie stood still and stared at it. Her eyes opened wider, her lips parted. On the third day, Sunday morning, Amelia placed a plate of butterfly pancakes, dusted with powdered sugar, on the little table in the garden. Rosalie sat across from her, the lavender scarf in her lap, staring at the pancake as though looking at someone familiar she wasn't sure was real or only a dream. Amelia didn't say eat. She didn't say try it. She didn't say a single word related to food. She only said, "Today the butterfly princess flew into a garden full of sunlight, where snow butterflies rested on the flowers." Rosalie looked at the pancake, then at Amelia, then back at the pancake. Then she held out both hands, broke off a tiny piece from one butterfly wing, and placed it in her mouth. She chewed very slowly, her eyes closing, and Amelia saw tears run down both sides of Rosalie's face. Silent tears, no sobbing, no crying out, only tears falling over the face of a 5-year-old child, tasting her mother again for the first time in 9 months. Amelia didn't wipe the tears away. She let Rosalie cry because these were the kind of tears that needed to fall, the kind of tears the 9 nannies before her and the 7 leading doctors had never given the child a chance to shed because they had been too busy trying to treat the symptom instead of treating the child. 10 minutes passed, 20 minutes. Rosalie didn't vomit. That tiny butterfly pancake, the piece she had broken off no bigger than a fingertip, rested quietly in her stomach as though it had always belonged there. It was the first real meal Rosalie Mercer had kept down in 9 months, and it hadn't come from a prescription or a treatment plan or $1,000,000 medical equipment. It had come from a butterfly-shaped pancake dusted with powdered sugar and a story about a princess who knew how to fly. After the butterfly pancake breakfast on Sunday morning, everything in the house began to shift in a way no one spoke aloud, yet everyone could feel. Rosalie ate one more small bite at lunch, then another at dinner. And although the amount of food was still far below what would have been normal for a 5-year-old child, she had stopped turning her face away at the sight of a plate, and to Amelia that was a greater victory than any number on a scale could ever be. But the thing that changed the most wasn't Rosalie. It was Ashton. Amelia realized he had begun appearing in places he had never set foot in before, or at least not at the hours when she was working with Rosalie. On the afternoon of the 4th day, while Amelia sat on the grass in the garden telling Princess Butterfly stories to Rosalie, she caught a glimpse of the shadow of a black suit behind the glass doors of the first-floor sitting room, not exactly hiding, but not stepping out either. Standing in that narrow space between spying and observing that only a person used to controlling everything knows how to occupy. On the 5th day, Amelia took Rosalie to the corner of the garden to finger paint on large sheets of paper, and when she looked up, Ashton was sitting on an iron chair about 15 meters away, holding a copy of the Wall Street Journal, but the paper didn't turn a single page during the entire 20 minutes she watched, and his gray eyes stayed fixed on the point above the edge of the newspaper, exactly where teacher and child were sitting. Amelia didn't call him over, didn't invite him, didn't comment. She simply noted that the man Nina said had never come home before 11 at night was now sitting in the garden at 4 in the afternoon, pretending to read a newspaper. On the 6th night, Amelia couldn't sleep. She went down to the kitchen at nearly 2 in the morning to get some water and stopped in the doorway because the lights were off inside, but someone was sitting at the island. She knew because of the smell of whiskey and the sound of ice striking the side of a glass in the dark. She turned on the small light above the sink, and the dim yellow glow was just enough to show Ashton Mercer sitting there, and for the first time since Amelia had entered this house, he looked like an ordinary man. No suit, no leather shoes, no armor, just an old black t-shirt, and when he reached for the whiskey glass, the sleeve pulled back and exposed his entire left arm, and Amelia saw the tattoos. Not the kind of tattoos made for decoration or style, but a list. Names. Dozens of names written in small black ink running from his wrist up beneath the sleeve, each name marked with a year, and Amelia didn't need to ask to know that every person named on his arm was dead. It was a family tree written in ink and loss, and Amelia realized that Ashton Mercer carried his dead on his skin in the most literal sense. "You should dress more properly when you walk around my house at 2 in the morning, he said without looking up. Amelia glanced down at her worn-out old pajamas and said, "And you shouldn't drink whiskey alone in the dark at 2 in the morning. For the first time, Amelia saw the corner of Ashton's mouth move slightly. Not a smile, but the shadow of the ability to smile. There and gone so quickly it was as if he had caught himself and forced it to stop. "How much did Rosalie eat today?" he asked, still looking at the whiskey in his hand. "More than yesterday. Less than she needs. But she's moving in the right direction." He nodded once, only once, and said nothing more, and Amelia took her water and went back upstairs. But on the staircase she turned to look back, and Ashton was still sitting there, alone, in the dark, with a glass of whiskey and an armful of dead names. And she thought that he and Rosalie were more alike than he realized, both of them keeping their pain sealed inside and refusing to let it out. On the 7th day, Amelia gave Rosalie tomato sauce on a white plate and let her draw with it, a sensory exercise to help the child become familiar with the color red again, without linking it to fear. Rosalie hesitated before touching the sauce with her fingertip, then began to draw. Amelia let her draw freely, and didn't look until Rosalie pushed the plate toward her. On the plate were 3 human figures made in tomato sauce. One small figure stood in the middle, with blonde hair, clearly Rosalie. On the left was a woman with brown hair, Amelia. On the right was a tall man with broad shoulders, Ashton. The 3 figures stood side by side with their hands joined, and above their heads Rosalie had drawn something that looked like a roof. Amelia said nothing. She only looked at the drawing and felt something both beautiful and dangerous tighten inside her chest, because she knew exactly what this drawing meant in the language of child psychology. It meant Rosalie was rebuilding a family inside her mind, and she had placed Amelia in the position that had once belonged to Colette. Ashton walked past the dining table at exactly that moment. His footsteps stopped, and Amelia saw him look down at the plate, with the drawing of 3 people, standing hand in hand beneath a roof. He stood still for exactly 5 seconds. Amelia counted. Then he walked away, faster than usual, and didn't look back. That night it rained hard, the kind of Chicago storm that falls like the sky has been split open, with thunder rolling through the darkness, and at 1:23 in the morning, Amelia jolted awake at the sound of a scream. Not a loud scream, but the strangled cry of a child trapped inside a nightmare, and she ran into the 3rd-floor hallway at the exact same moment Ashton came charging up from the stairs. They reached Rosalie's bedroom door together, almost colliding, and neither of them stopped to let the other pass. They pushed the door open at the same time. Rosalie was sitting in the middle of the bed, her eyes open but not fully awake, her hands fumbling for the lavender scarf that had fallen to the floor, and she was breathing in the sharp, desperate way Amelia immediately recognized as a nighttime panic attack. Amelia sat down on the left side of the bed, Ashton on the right, and at the same instant both of them reached out and took one of Rosalie's hands. Amelia holding the child's left hand, Ashton holding her right, and Rosalie's tiny fingers clutched both of them, as if she would drown if she let go. Amelia said softly, "Emmy is here. Papai is here too. You're safe." And slowly Rosalie's breathing eased, her eyes drifted closed, her fingers loosened, and she sank back into sleep between the two adults sitting on either side of her bed. In the darkness, with only flashes of lightning coming through the window, Amelia realized that her hand and Ashton's had touched on top of the blanket, just above Rosalie's tiny hand, the back of her hand pressed against the back of his, and she could feel the long scar on his skin brushing hers. Neither of them pulled away. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, then both of them withdrew at the same time, as if they had both counted to the same number, and Amelia turned her face toward the window while Ashton looked down at the floor, and neither of them said a single word about what had just happened, because they both knew that if either of them spoke of it, it would become real. And real, in this house, was the most dangerous thing of all. In the days after the night of rain, Rosalie began letting out tiny pieces of her voice, from the place where she had hidden them for 9 months. Not sentences, not yet. Only single words falling out like drops of water from a faucet that had been twisted shut for too long and was now beginning to leak. The morning after the storm, when Amelia placed a plate of fruit cut into star shapes in front of her in the garden, Rosalie looked at the plate, then at Amelia, and said, "More," her voice still hoarse and small, but clear and deliberate. On the 8th day, when Amelia tucked a wild daisy into Rosalie's hair, the child touched the flower's petals and said, "Pretty." On the 9th day, when Amelia walked into her room that morning, Rosalie looked up from the lavender scarf and said, "Emmy." And it was the first time she had called her by name, not Miss or Lady, but Emmy, the name the child had chosen herself, the name only someone close would use. And Amelia had to turn her face away for 2 seconds to keep the tears from falling, because she knew that if she cried in front of Rosalie, the child would think she had done something wrong. Her body was changing too. A little color had begun to return to her cheeks, instead of that paper-white emptiness. Her collarbones no longer rose through her nightgown as sharply as blades, and her eyes, those green eyes still large and cautious, now held something else beneath the caution, something Amelia could only call curiosity. The kind of curiosity that belongs to a child slowly beginning to remember that the world outside the cocoon of silence might not always be dangerous. On the 10th day, Amelia decided to try the thing she had been considering for 4 days: dinner at the main dining table. Since Colette's death, Rosalie had never once sat at the large dining table in the formal dining room. She ate on her bed or outside in the garden, and Ashton ate in his study, or didn't eat at home at all. The 12-seat oak table in the dining room had become a kind of no-man's land, a place where the memory of family dinners when Colette was still alive still clung to the wood like a stain no one could wipe away. Amelia asked Nina to set the table for 3 people, only 3, not 12, and to place the 3 chairs side by side at one end of the table, instead of spreading them far apart. She cooked bow tie pasta, but she didn't use red sauce. Instead, she made a white cream sauce with grated cheese, keeping the shape Rosalie had once loved, while removing the color that triggered fear. When Amelia led Rosalie into the dining room, the child stopped in the doorway and looked inside for a long time, and Amelia saw her fingers tighten around the lavender scarf. But then she stepped in, slowly, 1 step at a time, her eyes sweeping across the long table, as though searching for the shadow of someone who was no longer there. Ashton arrived just as Amelia was pulling out Rosalie's chair. He stood in the dining room doorway looking at the scene, his daughter sitting at the table where his wife used to sit, beside the woman he had hired as a nanny, and on the table was a plate of bow tie pasta, like the kind Colette used to make, and Amelia saw his jaw tighten, but he said nothing. He simply walked in and sat down in the 3rd chair, on Rosalie's other side, in exactly the place the child had drawn him in the tomato sauce picture on the plate. 3 people sitting at one end of a 12-seat table. The rest of the table looked empty and vast, but their little corner of 3 chairs pressed close together held something the entire 12-bedroom mansion did not: intimacy. Rosalie ate slowly, one small bite at a time, And Amelia told the story of how Princess Butterfly had flown that day into a kingdom where everyone shared dinner together, and Ashton listened in silence, not because he cared about the fairy tale, but because he was watching his daughter eat with the eyes of a man who didn't dare believe what he was seeing. Then Rosalie stopped eating. She set down her fork, looked at Amelia, then at Ashton, then down at the pasta on her plate, and Amelia realized the child was preparing to say something bigger than a single word. She could see it in the way Rosalie drew in a long breath, in the way her fingers rubbed the edge of the lavender scarf, in the way her eyes moved back and forth between the two adults, as though deciding whether it was safe. Mama said, "Don't tell anyone." Rosalie's voice was small, but every word came clearly. But Mama was really scared of Uncle Vic. Ashton's fork fell onto the china plate with a clang that rang through the vast dining room, and the sound echoed back from the high ceiling like an alarm bell. He didn't pick it up. He sat perfectly still, both hands on the table, and Amelia saw his knuckles turning whiter and whiter as his hands closed into fists. Uncle Vic. Victor Hale. Ashton Mercer's right hand for 18 years. The man Frank Mercer had trusted even before his own son. The man with access to every system in this house. The man who sat in every meeting, knew every secret, and held every string. Amelia didn't look at Ashton. She kept her eyes on Rosalie because the child was trembling lightly after saying aloud the things she had swallowed for 9 months. And the priority now wasn't the father's reaction, but the emotional safety of the child. Amelia laid her hand gently over Rosalie's and said, "Thank you for telling Emmy, sweetheart. You were very brave." But inside Amelia's mind, everything was rearranging itself for the second time since she had seen the 9 drawings on the bedside table. Rosalie wasn't silent because of ordinary psychological trauma after her mother's death. Rosalie was silent because she knew something about that death, something connected to Victor Hale, something Colette had warned her daughter not to tell anyone, and the child had kept her promise to her mother by sealing her mouth completely shut, refusing food because her body couldn't carry both the secret and the food at the same time. It had to choose one, and she had chosen to keep the secret. Now that secret had begun to leak out, and Amelia understood that from this moment on, the story was no longer only about a little girl who wouldn't eat. It was about a man named Victor Hale, and whatever he had done that had frightened a mother so deeply, she had told her 5-year-old daughter to keep it secret at any cost, and that cost had nearly been Rosalie's life. After Rosalie had been taken back to her room and fallen asleep with the lavender scarf clutched tightly in her hands, Ashton didn't return to his study as he did every night. He stood in the 3rd-floor hallway staring at his daughter's door for a long time, then turned to Amelia and said only 2 words, "Follow me." He led her down to the library, the same room where they had first met, but tonight it looked different, smaller, darker, and Ashton didn't stand by the window looking down at the garden. Instead, he sat in the chair opposite the desk, on the same side as Amelia, with no desk between them, and Amelia understood that this was a deliberate choice. He was removing the physical barrier he always kept between himself and everyone else. "Victor Hale has worked for my family since before I took over," Ashton said, his voice even, but Amelia could hear something underneath it, something simmering very slowly. 18 years. He knows everything about my family, about the business, about Colette, about Rosalie. If my daughter is afraid of him, I need to know why, and I need to know now, but that wasn't the real reason he had called her down here. Amelia knew because the next thing he said had nothing to do with Victor. "Why do you understand my daughter this well?" It wasn't a rhetorical question, and it wasn't praise. It was a demand for an explanation from a man accustomed to requiring answers for everything. 7 doctors failed to see what you saw in the first 30 minutes. 9 nannies couldn't get her to speak in 9 months. You did it in less than a day. I'm not asking out of curiosity. I'm asking because I need to understand what it is you're using that I've never seen in anyone before. Amelia was silent for 10 seconds. Not because she hesitated, but because she was deciding how deep she was willing to go, how many % of the door she had kept locked. For 21 years she was willing to open in front of a man she had known for less than 2 weeks. A man who might very well be the most dangerous crime boss in Chicago. Then she thought of Rosalie, of those frightened green eyes and that hoarse little voice after 9 months. And she realized that if she truly wanted to save that child, the father had to understand, not only with his mind, but with something deeper. Because I was that little girl. Ashton didn't move. 21 years ago, when I was 6, my father was shot to death. Amelia spoke in a flat voice, the voice she had practiced for years in therapy sessions for herself. the voice that could tell something horrifying without breaking because she had already broken too many times and had learned how to piece herself back together. My father owned a small grocery store on the South Side, a man who believed in the law until the day the law failed to protect him. He witnessed something he wasn't supposed to witness. He agreed to testify, and 3 weeks before the trial, 2 men walked into the store at closing and shot him 3 times. No one was ever arrested. The case was filed away as unsolved. Amelia stopped just long enough to take a breath. My mother couldn't survive it. She fell into severe depression, stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped getting out of bed. 3 months after my father died, my mother hanged herself in the bathroom. I was the one who found her. 6 years old. Ashton still didn't move, but Amelia noticed that his right hand, the hand with the long scar, was slowly closing over the arm of the chair. After my mother died, I stopped speaking, completely, exactly like Rosalie. Not because I had lost the ability to speak, but because I believed that if I opened my mouth, if I told anyone what I had seen and heard, more people would die. That 6-year-old girl believed that words killed people because her father told the truth and was murdered, so she shut her mouth to make sure no one else would die. That is exactly what your daughter is doing now, Amelia continued. I couldn't eat. My body refused food because it was using all of its energy to keep the secret and hold the fear. I was hospitalized for severe malnutrition when I was 7, weighing as much as a 4-year-old child, and the doctor told the social worker that I might not survive. I had no father, no mother, no relatives willing to take me in. The foster care system moved me through 5 families in 12 years. The first family used me to collect government money and then locked me in a room. The second family starved me as punishment when I wouldn't speak. The third family was better, but they sent me back after 6 months because they said I was too difficult to care for. The fourth and fifth weren't cruel, but they weren't enough either. No one was enough, because no one understood that I didn't need to be fixed. I needed to be safe. The only person, Amelia said, and for the first time her voice trembled slightly, the only person who understood was my grandmother. She wasn't allowed to raise me because she was considered too old and too poor by the system's standards. But she was allowed to visit me every weekend. Every Saturday she came with a plastic container of food she had cooked, and she sat with me. She didn't force me to eat, didn't force me to speak. She only cooked and told stories and waited. She waited for 2 years. 2 years, every Saturday, never missing once. And one day I ate. And one day after that I spoke, not because she cured me with some miracle method, but because after 2 years my body finally believed there was one person who wouldn't disappear, wouldn't die, wouldn't leave. And when the body believes that, it allows you to open. That is exactly what I am doing with Rosalie. I am not a doctor, not a magician, and I don't have any method that textbooks don't mention. I am simply the person who understands her, because I am that child, 21 years ago, Mr. Mercer, and I know exactly what she needs because I know exactly what I needed. The silence in the library lasted a very long time. Amelia could hear the wall clock ticking, hear the wind outside the windows, hear Ashton breathing, and she waited. Then Ashton did something Amelia had not expected. He stood up, walked to the drinks cabinet, but instead of pouring whiskey as he did every night, he opened the small refrigerator below it, took out a bottle of water, poured it into a glass, walked over to Amelia, and placed the glass of water in front of her. He said nothing. He only set the glass down and went back to his chair and sat. And Amelia understood that all his life, Ashton Mercer had been the man others poured drinks for, the man others opened doors for, the man others pulled out chairs for. He was the one being served, not the one serving. And the act of getting up to pour a glass of water for her, for a 27-year-old nanny drowning in debt and wearing glue-mended sneakers, that small, ordinary act that anyone could have done, was the greatest revolution this man had carried out in years. He didn't say thank you, didn't say I'm sorry about your past, didn't say any of the things people usually say when they hear a painful story. And Amelia was grateful for that, because she didn't need pity. She had received enough pity from social workers and foster families and friends and professors for 21 years. What Ashton did instead was something none of them had ever done. He was silent. He listened. And he poured her a glass of water because that was the only thing he knew how to give in that moment. Amelia picked up the glass and drank, and between the two of them in the silent library near midnight, an unspoken agreement was signed. Not the 47-page contract with the $500,000 penalty clause, but an agreement between two people who both knew what loss was and who were both trying, each in their own way, to make sure a 5-year-old child didn't have to lose anything more. Victor Hale knew Rosalie was starting to speak again, before Ashton had even decided what to do with the information the child revealed at dinner. Not because anyone told him, but because Victor had survived for 18 years in this world, by knowing everything before other people even realized they had let something slip, and this house had cameras in every corner that he could access just as easily as Ashton could. He replayed the dining room footage that night in his private room, and when he heard the hoarse voice of the 5-year-old child say the 2 words Uncle Vic, his hand tightened around the computer mouse so hard that the plastic creaked. 9 months. 9 months the child hadn't opened her mouth, and he had believed the secret would die inside that silence, that a 5-year-old wouldn't be capable of holding a memory long enough or clearly enough to become a threat. And now that Nanny with the glue-patched sneakers from the south side had shattered the wall that time and trauma had built, and the child was beginning to speak, and if she said more, if she told the details about the night Colette cried, and told her daughter that Uncle Vic was a bad man, if she remembered that her mother had been preparing to run away with a USB drive hidden in her handbag, then Victor Hale wouldn't just lose his position, he would lose his life. He needed to act fast, but he couldn't act directly, because Ashton was watching Rosalie more closely than ever, and any move aimed at the child or the nanny right now would be noticed immediately. He needed another front, another hand to hold the knife while he kept his own hidden, and he knew exactly who that person was. Paige Mercer, 44 years old, Ashton's older sister, living in a penthouse on the Magnificent Mile on family money, and on the absolute belief that the Mercers were royalty, and that anyone who didn't carry their blood was beneath them. Victor called Paige at 10 o'clock the next morning, and he knew exactly which button to press. Paige, I need to talk to you about the nanny Ashton hired. Paige had disliked Amelia from the first moment she heard about her. Some girl no one knew the background of, no family, no connections, from the south side walking into the Astor Street mansion, and sleeping under the same roof as the only granddaughter of the Mercer family. But Paige hadn't acted, because she had no ammunition. She only had class hatred and instinctive contempt, and that wasn't enough to convince Ashton. Victor gave her ammunition. I checked her file, Victor said in the voice he had practiced for 18 years. The voice of a loyal man reporting facts, not the voice of someone protecting a murderous secret. She was fired from a child psychology clinic for violating professional ethics. The file says so clearly. There was silence for 5 seconds on the other end of the line. Then Paige said, I knew it. Victor continued, There's more. She has a file with Illinois Child Protective Services, and her name appears in police records related to abuse. Paige, she could be anyone. She could be planted by the FBI to get close to Ashton through Rosalie. She could be an investigative journalist in disguise. She could be a con artist targeting the family fortune. We don't know, and that is exactly the problem. Victor heard Paige draw in a long breath on the other end of the line, the kind of breath a person takes when everything their instincts had warned them from the start has just been confirmed. Does Ashton know? Paige asked. Ashton is blinded by the fact that Rosalie has started speaking again. He doesn't see anything beyond the result, and I understand that because he is her father. But someone has to stay clear-headed in his place. I'll look into it further, Paige said, her voice already shifting from suspicion to resolve. No need, Victor said. I already hired someone. Ricky Saunders, a private investigator who specializes in background checks for families on the Forbes list. He'll have a full report in a few days. When I get the results, I'll send them to you first. You'll know what to do with them. Paige understood immediately. Victor provided the weapon. Paige would fire it. If everything fell apart, Victor would be nothing more than the loyal advisor worried about the family's security, while Paige would simply be the protective older sister defending her brother. No one would see the real hand pulling the strings, the hand that still had the smell of Colette Mercer's brake fluid beneath the fingernails after 9 months. Victor ended the call and looked out the window of his room in the mansion. Down in the garden, Amelia was sitting on the grass beside Rosalie, the two of them cutting butterfly shapes out of paper and gluing them onto a small kite. And Rosalie was laughing. Not a big laugh, but a laugh, and he thought that this nanny was more dangerous than any FBI agent or federal prosecutor he had ever dealt with. Because those people he could buy or frighten or eliminate, but this girl was doing something he couldn't buy or frighten or eliminate. She was making the child trust her. And a child who trusts is a child who will tell everything. Ricky Saunders sent the report to Victor through encrypted email, 4 days after the phone call, and Victor read it in his private room at midnight with the first smile he had worn in weeks. The report was 17 pages long, and every page contained enough truth to destroy anyone's career. But Victor's genius didn't lie in inventing lies. It lay in twisting, in taking the truth and tilting it a few degrees until it looked like something entirely different. First, Amelia Vance had been fired from the Lincoln Park Child Psychology Clinic, the reason listed in her personnel file as ethical misconduct. The truth was that she had reported the director for overprescribing medication to children, but the personnel file didn't record why she made the report, only that she had been terminated, and Victor didn't need anyone reading the part the file didn't mention. Second, DCFS, the Illinois Child Protection Agency, had an investigative file connected to Amelia Vance's name when she was 16. The truth was that Amelia was the reporting party. She had reported her second foster family for starving and abusing children, and the investigation ended with that family permanently stripped of their foster license. But in Ricky's report, the only line printed in bold was DCFS investigation involving Amelia Vance, and Victor knew that when Paige read that line, she wouldn't ask what role Amelia had held in the investigation. She would assume that a girl raised by the system had been the subject of the investigation, rather than the one who reported it, because that was how people like Paige looked at people like Amelia. Third, Cook County police records listed Amelia Vance's name in a domestic abuse report. The truth was that Amelia had been the victim who filed the abuse report against that same second foster family, the very incident that led to the DCFS investigation. But on paper, name in police records related to abuse could mean anything, and Victor was certain that when Paige read it, she would choose the worst interpretation possible. Fourth, Amelia owed $87,000 in student loans, along with rent that was 2 months overdue and an eviction notice. Victor circled that number and wrote beside it the word motive, because in his world, a person in debt was a person who could be bought, and a person who could be bought was a person who couldn't be trusted. Victor sent the full report to Paige with one short line: "I'll let you decide what should be done. I am only the one providing information." He knew Paige would do exactly what he wanted while believing it had been her own idea. Paige read the report at 7 in the morning over an espresso in her magnificent Mile penthouse, and every page she turned was another bullet being loaded into a gun. By the final page, she had made 3 phone calls. The first was to Audrey Cole, Colette's maternal aunt, a 62-year-old woman who had wanted custody of Rosalie from the day Colette died because she believed Ashton didn't deserve to be a father and that his house wasn't safe for a child. And when Paige told her that the woman caring for Rosalie had records with DCFS and the police, Audrey nearly shouted into the phone, "I'm calling my lawyer today." The second was to Thomas Mercer, Ashton's cousin, 38 years old, the family attorney who kept every legal file and knew exactly how to turn information into a weapon of law. And Thomas said only one sentence after hearing Paige's summary: "If this information is accurate, then we have legal grounds to demand that she leave the house immediately." The third was to Father Bennett, the priest of the Mercer family for 25 years, ever since he baptized Ashton. The man this Irish Catholic family regarded as the voice of morality and conscience. And when Paige told him that the nanny had a history of abuse and was influencing a child who had lost her mother, Father Bennett sighed and said, "Protecting children is our most sacred duty. I will be there when the family needs me." Within 48 hours, the rumor spread through the Mercer family's circle of power like fire on oil, not through the press or social media, but through the whisper network of powerful people, through lunches at private clubs, through phone calls between the wives of underbosses, through the looks in the eyes of bodyguards when Amelia passed them in the hallway. "The nanny girl used to hurt children," someone said in the kitchen when they thought Amelia couldn't hear. "She came for the money," someone else said at the gate when she took Rosalie out to the garden. "Ashton is bewitched. He can't see anything except that the child has started talking again." And that was the sentence Amelia heard most clearly because it was spoken directly behind her as she crossed the main hall. Amelia wasn't stupid. She knew something was happening. She could feel the shift in the way the bodyguards looked at her, the way the house staff avoided her eyes, the way the air in the house thickened every time she walked into a room where someone other than Rosalie was present. But she didn't know how large it was until Nina found her that evening in the kitchen after Rosalie had gone to sleep. Nina closed the kitchen door and said quietly, "You need to hear what I'm about to say, and you need to listen very carefully. Someone is investigating your past. They have your termination file, the DCFS file, the police file, and they are twisting everything in the worst possible direction. Paige Mercer is building an alliance to force you out of here, and she has the support of the family lawyer, the family priest, and Colette's aunt. Amelia felt the kitchen floor beneath her suddenly lose its steadiness, but she kept her voice calm. Does Ashton know? Nina shook her head. Not yet, but he will soon. And you need to prepare yourself. Because in this family, when they decide to get rid of someone, they don't just show her the door. Nina stopped, looked directly into Amelia's eyes, and the next thing she said came in a voice so low Amelia had to lean forward to hear it clearly. In this family, the people they remove sometimes disappear, and no one asks where they went. The meeting was called for Friday night, and Victor chose that moment because he knew Ashton was most exhausted at the end of the work week, because he knew Amelia would be upstairs on the 3rd floor with Rosalie and would have no idea what was happening, and because he knew that the main meeting room on the 1st floor of the mansion, the room with the 4-meter walnut table and the red velvet curtains drawn tightly across the windows, was the place where the Mercer family had made decisions that determined other people's fates for 3 generations. And anyone who sat at that table understood that this wasn't a place for idle talk. When Ashton walked in at 8 that evening, he knew at once that something was wrong because the room was already full. Victor sat in the middle of the table, directly opposite Ashton, the position that in any previous meeting he would never have taken, because it was the seat of direct opposition to the head of the family. Paige sat to Victor's right, her back straight, her lips pressed together, dressed in black as though attending a trial. Thomas Mercer sat to the left, and in front of him was a thick file that Ashton recognized immediately as legal documents, because Thomas never brought papers to a family meeting unless someone was about to be sued or removed. Mrs. Audrey Cole sat in the far corner, her hand gripping the silver chain with Colette's pendant that she had worn since the day of the funeral, and her eyes were fixed on Ashton, with the same accusation he had seen in them for 9 months. The look that said, "You let my daughter die, and now you are letting my granddaughter die with her." Father Bennett sat beside Audrey, his white priest's collar standing out in the dark room, his hands folded together on the table with the solemnity of a man who believed he was doing the work of God. At the far end of the table sat 2 underbosses from the organization, men Ashton hadn't invited, but Victor had, because he wanted Ashton to understand that this wasn't only a family matter, this was a matter for the entire empire. And on the large screen mounted to the wall, the face of Frank Mercer, 72 years old, appeared through a video call from Palm Beach, Florida. An aged face with eyes still sharp as blades, and a voice that could still make an entire room fall silent the moment he spoke. Ashton looked around the room and understood immediately that this wasn't a meeting. It was a trial, and he was the only one who hadn't known the charges in advance. Victor opened with the voice he had practiced for 18 years to sound like loyalty instead of betrayal. Ashton, all of us are here for one reason only: Rosalie's safety and the safety of this family. I carried out a background check on the nanny as part of the standard security procedure, and the results are deeply concerning. Victor opened the file and presented each point, his voice even, adding nothing, taking nothing away, simply reading what Ricky Saunders had written, but reading it in the order he had arranged, so that each point followed the one before it, and built a picture that grew darker and darker. Fired for ethical misconduct. DCFS investigation connected to her name. Police record connected to abuse. $87,000 in debt. Paige spoke the moment Victor set the file down, as though she had rehearsed it many times. And perhaps she had. This is a serious security threat. We don't know who this person really is. We don't know who sent her. And she is sleeping under the same roof as the only granddaughter of this family, while having a record with Child Protective Services. Thomas opened the legal file and spoke in the cold, precise, emotionless voice of a lawyer. From a legal standpoint, we have an individual who was fired for ethical misconduct, investigated by DCFS in a matter involving children, named in police records concerning abuse, and who is now directly caring for the only granddaughter of the Mercer family. If anyone outside this house finds out about this, we will lose custody of Rosalie before we even have time to hire a lawyer. Audrey tapped her fingers on the table. Colette would never have allowed this. My niece would rise from the grave if she knew her little girl was being cared for by someone with a history of child abuse. Father Bennett spoke slowly, each word heavy as a stone being laid on the table. I have served this family for 25 years. I baptized Ashton. I baptized Rosalie. I presided over Colette's funeral. Protecting children is the most sacred duty God gives us. And if there is any doubt, even the smallest doubt, about Rosalie's safety, then we have a moral obligation to act. Then Frank spoke from the screen, and the whole room fell silent, because when the old Don spoke, no one breathed too hard. "Son," Frank's voice came rough through the speaker, "I love you, and I love Rosalie, but I have lived 72 years, and I have learned one thing. People who come from mud sometimes carry mud with them, no matter how clean they wash themselves." Ashton sat at the head of the table and felt something he rarely ever felt: helplessness. He looked at the file in front of Victor and saw black and white words that looked terribly convincing. Fired, DCFS, police, abuse, debt. Each word another brick building the wall of accusation. But on the other side of that wall, he saw Amelia sitting on the floor of Rosalie's room, kneeling to meet his daughter at eye level, and Rosalie saying, "Don't go to her," in the voice he had been starving to hear for 9 months. He saw his daughter eating butterfly pancakes and crying in silence. He saw 3 chairs pushed close together at the end of the 12-seat dining table. He saw his hand brushing against hers over the blanket on the rainy night. The evidence said one thing, his instincts said another, and Ashton Mercer, a man used to making million-dollar decisions in a second, didn't know for the first time in his life which one he should trust. Victor saw that hesitation and knew it was the most dangerous moment of all, because if Ashton chose to trust Amelia, then every move he had made would collapse, so he pushed the final piece across the board. "I propose that we require her to leave tonight. I will personally make sure she understands that everything she has seen and heard in this house should be forgotten, completely." Victor spoke that last word more softly than the rest of the sentence, and it was that softness that made it 10 times heavier, because everyone in that room understood what "make sure she forgets" meant, and it had nothing to do with politeness or non-disclosure agreements. Ashton looked at Victor for a long time, and in that look there was something new that Victor had never seen before. Not anger, not agreement, but suspicion. And not suspicion directed at Amelia, but suspicion turning in another direction, though Victor didn't recognize it because he was too busy congratulating himself. "Before I decide anything," Ashton said at last, his voice so cold that the temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees, "I want her to have a chance to explain herself, in front of everyone in this room." Amelia stepped into the meeting room 10 minutes after Nina knocked on her door on the 3rd floor and told her, more with her eyes than with words, that she needed to come downstairs immediately, and those 10 minutes weren't because she needed to prepare herself emotionally, but because she needed to retrieve something from the bottom of her backpack, the clear plastic document pouch she had carried with her from her studio on the South Side on the very first day she came here. Not because she had known this would happen, but because 21 years of living inside the system had taught her to always carry evidence on her body, because there would always come a day when someone would demand that she prove she deserved to exist. She walked through the meeting room door, and 10 faces turned toward her at once. And Amelia understood immediately that this wasn't a conversation. It was a trial. She was the defendant, and the verdict had already been written before she stepped inside. Victor sat in the middle of the table with the file already open, his face wearing the false, grave expression of a man savoring every second. Paige sat upright, looking at her with the kind of eyes Amelia had seen hundreds of times before, in teachers looking at foster children, in landlords looking at tenants late on rent, in restaurant managers looking at her over a sink full of dishes, the eyes of people who had already decided who she was before she ever had the chance to open her mouth. Thomas sat behind the legal file as though behind a stone wall. Audrey held the necklace with Colette's pendant, and looked at Amelia as though looking at the woman occupying her daughter's place. Father Bennett had both hands folded on the table with the sorrowful dignity of a man who believed he was about to witness justice. Frank Mercer on the screen looked down into the room as though from above. The 2 underbosses sat at the far end of the table, silent, measuring, and Ashton sat at the head of the table, his gray eyes fixed on her, and Amelia couldn't read what he was thinking because he had pulled the steel back up around himself, completely sealed. Amelia didn't cry. She didn't shake, not because she was brave, but because she had stood before too many rooms like this already. The room at DCFS when she was 16, and reported her foster family, and the social workers looked at her as though she were the troublemaker. The room at the clinic when she reported the director and the disciplinary board looked at her as though she were the traitor. The unofficial courtroom of her entire life, where the world looked at a foster kid with no parents and decided in advance that she was guilty simply because she came from the place where guilty people came from. She placed the plastic document pouch on the table and opened it. "I will address every point you have raised." Her voice was calm and clear, the voice of someone who had been forced to learn self-defense, long before she was old enough to drive. First, I was fired from the Lincoln Park Clinic for ethical misconduct. That is true, but it is only half the truth. Amelia pulled out the first document and placed it on the table. This is a copy of the complaint I filed with the Illinois State Licensing Board, stamped with the official date of receipt, reporting the clinic director for overprescribing sedatives to children in exchange for kickbacks from a pharmaceutical company. I was fired because I reported him, not because I committed misconduct. The personnel file says ethical misconduct because the director wrote the personnel file, and the person being reported never writes anything kind about the person who reported him. Paige frowned but said nothing. Thomas picked up the paper and checked the official stamp. Amelia pulled out the second document. Second, DCFS investigated a case connected to my name. Yes, my name appears in a DCFS file, but as the reporting party, not as the person being investigated. When I was 16, I reported my second foster family for starving children and locking me in a room as punishment when I wouldn't speak. This is the outcome of that investigation from DCFS. That family had their foster license permanently revoked and was banned from receiving foster children in any future circumstances. I am not someone who harms children. I am the child who was harmed. Audrey let go of the necklace and lowered her eyes to the table. Father Bennett blinked twice in quick succession. Amelia pulled out the third document. Third, Cook County police records list my name in connection with abuse. Yes, because I was the person who filed the report. I was the victim who opened the case to protect myself, not the perpetrator. This is a copy of the report. You can see clearly that my name appears under complainant, not respondent. And finally, Amelia didn't pull out another paper. She looked directly at Victor, then at Paige, then let her gaze move across every person in the room. I owe $87,000 in student loans. That is true. I owe that money because I put myself through school. I had no father, no mother, no family paying for me, no trust fund with my name on it, no one co-signing a single paper for me. Every cent of that debt was exchanged for 6 years of college and graduate school, for nights working 3 jobs at once, for sweat and sleep deprivation, and the cheapest boxed meals in the grocery store. If owing tuition debt because I built my life by myself is a crime, then yes, I am guilty. But it is the kind of crime I would commit again 100 times if I were given the choice. Silence filled the meeting room, a different kind of silence from the one that had existed before Amelia walked in. Amelia added, her voice still steady, though Ashton, who had heard her tell the full story in the library the night before, noticed that her eyes were a little redder along the lower rims. I understand, Rosalie, because I was that little girl, 21 years ago. I lost my parents. I stopped speaking. I stopped eating. I nearly died. And I know exactly how to lead her out of the dark, because I walked out of that dark myself. She didn't offer more details. She didn't need to. What she had said was enough, and Ashton understood that she was protecting her story by refusing to turn it into a weapon for pity. She was using it as evidence, clean, sharp, precise. Frank Mercer spoke first from the screen. His voice was completely different from what it had been 20 minutes earlier, no longer firm and superior, but trembling, truly trembling. The voice of a 72-year-old man who had just realized he was wrong. Child, he said, and that single word made Paige flinch, because Frank Mercer never called anyone outside the family child. Forgive an old man. Father Bennett lowered his head, both hands still folded on the table, but now folded more tightly, and he closed his eyes for 1 second as though praying or ashamed, perhaps both. Thomas closed the legal file without a word. A small gesture, but in a Mercer family meeting room it sounded as loud as a judge's gavel. Audrey looked at Amelia with wet eyes and said nothing, but her hand had released the necklace. Paige sat motionless, her back still straight, but her face had gone paler by a shade, and her mouth was pressed into the straight, hard line of someone swallowing something very difficult to swallow. Perhaps shame, perhaps just the sting of being proven wrong in front of the whole family. The two underbosses exchanged a quick glance and then looked away. The glance of men who understood that the wind was changing direction, but Victor didn't shift. Amelia saw that more clearly than anyone because she had kept her eyes on him while speaking, and while the whole room was changing, softening, opening, Victor Hale still sat in the middle of the table wearing the same expression he had brought into the room, and Amelia realized that he wasn't disappointed because the case against her was collapsing. He was calculating his next move, and that realization sent a cold chill down her spine. because it confirmed what she had sensed ever since Rosalie said the words "Uncle Vic" at the dinner table, that Victor Hale didn't just want her gone because of some security concern. He wanted her to disappear because she was making the child speak, and there was something that child could say that would destroy him. The trial ended close to 11 o'clock that night without a final verdict. Ashton said he needed time to think, and everyone left in silence. Paige didn't look at anyone as she walked out the door. Audrey was taken home by Thomas. Father Bennett murmured something that might have been a prayer or an apology, and Frank ended the video call after saying once more, "Forgive an old man." Amelia went upstairs to the 3rd floor to check on Rosalie. The child was still sleeping peacefully. The lavender scarf clutched tightly in her hand, her breathing even, and Amelia stood in the doorway watching her for 2 full minutes before going back to her own room and lying down. But she couldn't sleep because Victor's face kept rising in her mind, that unmoved face, the face of a man calculating his next move. She didn't know that move would come so quickly. Victor waited until 2:50 in the morning, when the whole house had sunk into darkness, and even the night shift guards were at their fixed posts on the 1st floor, as far from the 3rd floor as possible. He opened his laptop in his private room, logged into the security system using the highest level access code he possessed, the same level as Ashton, authority granted 18 years earlier when Frank was still running everything, and trusted Victor as he trusted his own right hand, and he shut off every camera on the 3rd floor. He didn't erase them, only turned them off, so that when someone checked later they would see a gap of 25 minutes in the recorded data, from 2:50 until 3:15, and he knew that gap could be explained away by dozens of technical excuses if necessary. He walked along the 3rd floor hallway without shoes, his socks making no sound on the wooden floor, past the 7 turned-over photographs of Colette, past Amelia's bedroom door, where he paused for 2 seconds to listen, and then kept going, until he reached the last door in the corridor with the peeling butterfly stickers. He opened Rosalie's bedroom door so gently that the hinges didn't even have time to creak. The room was dark, but enough streetlight slipped through the curtains for him to see Rosalie curled in the corner of the bed, and he stepped to the bedside, bent down close to the face of the sleeping child, and whispered, "Rosalie." She opened her eyes. Her green eyes, still fogged with sleep, looked up and found Victor Hale's face, less than 30 centimeters from her own in the dark, and her eyes widened with the kind of primitive fear only a child can feel in its purest form. Fear untouched by logic. Fear, with nothing diluted in it. Victor whispered slowly and clearly, each word shaped with the voice he knew would carve itself into the mind of a 5-year-old, like a knife into wood. "If you tell anyone anything, Amelia will disappear. Just like Mama." Rosalie didn't scream. She didn't cry. She did something worse than screaming or crying. She curled herself into the smallest ball she could make, pulled the lavender scarf up over her face, and shut down completely. Instantly, like an iron gate slamming shut, and Victor knew he had erased everything Amelia had spent 2 weeks building, with 1 sentence of 14 words. He left the room, closed the door softly, went back to his own room, turned the 3rd floor cameras back on at 3:15, and lay down in bed and slept well for the first time in weeks. The next morning, when Amelia walked into Rosalie's room at 7, she knew at once that something was wrong. Rosalie lay curled in the corner of the bed like a cocoon, the lavender scarf covering her face, and when Amelia sat beside her and called softly, "Rosalie, Emmy is here," the child didn't respond, didn't move, didn't open her eyes, not because she was asleep, but because she had retreated completely inward, shut the door, turned the lock, and thrown away the key. Amelia placed her hand over Rosalie's back through the blanket, and felt the child's body rigid beneath her palm, every muscle tight as a wire, the kind of tension Amelia recognized immediately as the defensive response of a child who had been threatened in her sleep, a body thrown into survival mode and not yet allowed to come out of it. Amelia didn't force Rosalie to speak, didn't force her to open her eyes. She simply sat beside her and sang softly the song she had sung to her in recent days. But the child didn't react, didn't move, and when Nina brought up a tray with milk and bread, Rosalie didn't touch it, and Amelia knew that someone had destroyed 2 weeks of her work in a single night. She left Rosalie's room and went straight to the security room on the 1st floor, where a guard sat in front of 12 surveillance monitors. She told the guard she needed to review the 3rd floor cameras from the night before, and the guard looked at her with hesitation because she was the nanny, not a family member. But Amelia spoke in a voice she hadn't used once since entering this house. Not the voice of the nanny, but the voice of a psychologist protecting a patient. Someone got to that child in the night, and I need to know who. You either show me now, or I call the police to come and look. Your choice. The guard showed her, and Amelia saw the gap. 25 minutes of complete blackness, from 2:50 until 3:15 in the morning. Every single camera on the third floor shutting off at once, and then coming back on at once. Not a technical error, because technical errors don't switch off every camera on one floor at the same moment, and then restore them exactly 25 minutes later. This was someone deliberately disabling the system. Someone with the highest level access code. Amelia asked the guard who, besides Mr. Mercer, had the authority to shut down an entire floor of cameras, and the guard gave her only one name: Mr. Hale. Amelia didn't run, didn't panic. She walked up the stairs at a normal pace, but every step felt heavier than the one before, because she was carrying the weight of the realization that the man Ashton trusted most had gone into his daughter's room at 3 in the morning and done something that made the child curl in on herself as though she had watched her mother die all over again. She knocked on Ashton's study door and didn't wait for him to invite her in. She opened the door and walked inside, then placed her phone on his desk. On the screen was the photograph she had taken of the third floor camera data, showing the 25-minute gap of total blackness. Someone went into Rosalie's room last night at 3 in the morning, Amelia said, and that person shut off the cameras before going in. Other than you, there is only one person who can do that. Ashton looked at the photograph on the phone, and Amelia watched his jaw tighten with enough force that in the silence of the room, she could hear his teeth grinding together. Ashton didn't say a single word after looking at the camera image. He simply stood up and walked out of the study, and Amelia followed because she knew he was going upstairs to the third floor, to Rosalie's room, and she needed to be there because whatever Ashton Mercer was outside this house, inside his daughter's room at this moment, he was a father boiling with rage. And the child, in the most fragile state she had ever been in, didn't need any energy stronger than a whisper. Amelia touched Ashton's arm at the end of the third-floor hallway, and he stopped, turned to look at her, and she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Not the cold calculation of a boss, not the exhaustion of a helpless father, but pure anger, the kind of anger that doesn't need shouting because it has gone far beyond shouting, the kind of silent anger, white as the heart of a flame. You need to calm down before you go into her room, Amelia said. She's scared. If she sees you afraid or angry, she'll think she did something wrong, and she'll shut down forever. Ashton closed his eyes for 3 seconds. When he opened them again, the rage was still there, but it had been forced down, clamped tight beneath the layer of control he had trained into himself over 20 years, in a world where losing control meant losing your life. They entered Rosalie's room together. The child was still curled in the corner of the bed, the lavender scarf covering her head, and when she heard footsteps, her body tightened further, smaller, as though she were trying to turn herself invisible. Amelia sat down on the left side of the bed, gently, slowly, and Ashton sat on the right, and Amelia realized he was copying the way she sat. Slow, careful, making no loud sound, and she understood that he was learning from her in this very moment. The most powerful man in Chicago, learning from a 27-year-old nanny how to sit beside his own daughter. Amelia reached out and placed her hand over Rosalie's tiny hand, the one clutching the lavender scarf, not pulling, not prying, only resting her hand there, and she spoke in the gentlest voice she had. Rosalie, Amy is here. Popeye is here too. You're safe. No one can hurt you while both of us are here. No movement, no response. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Then Amelia felt Rosalie's fingers beneath her hand loosen slightly, just a little, and the child pulled the lavender scarf down from her face, and those green eyes looked up, red-rimmed, swollen, the eyes of a child who had cried all night without making a sound. Rosalie looked at Amelia, then looked at Ashton, and Amelia could see the hesitation in her, the weighing of things, the battle inside a 5-year-old mind, between the fear Victor had planted the night before and the trust Amelia had spent 2 weeks building. "Sweetheart," Ashton said, and his voice, the voice Amelia had heard giving orders cold as steel, the voice all of Chicago feared, was now so soft it was almost breaking. "Did someone come into your room last night?" Rosalie trembled. Her whole body trembled, not from cold, but from standing at the edge between speaking and staying silent, between trusting and being afraid. And Amelia gave her hand a light squeeze and said, You're safe now. Emmy is here. No one is disappearing. Rosalie looked at Amelia, looked deep into her eyes as though searching for proof inside that promise, and perhaps she found it, because she opened her mouth, and her voice came out small and shattered, like a glass falling onto a stone floor. Uncle Vic said if I tell, Emmy will disappear. Like Mama. Ashton didn't move. Not a single muscle in his body moved. He sat utterly still like a statue, and Amelia realized it wasn't calmness. It was freezing. The kind of freezing that happens when the mind receives something too large to process, and every system inside it halts for 1 second. Amelia kept her voice steady. Can you tell Emmy more, sweetheart? Did Mama say anything about Uncle Vic? Rosalie nodded, and this time her voice came out clearer, as though once the door had opened even a little, it could never close completely again. Mama said Uncle Vic is a bad man. Mama cried. Mama said she wanted to take me far, far away, but Uncle Vic wouldn't let Mama leave. Silence filled the room. The kind of silence Amelia could feel with physical weight pressing on her chest. Then Ashton Mercer exploded. Not the kind of explosion made of shouting and smashing things, but the kind that comes from a person who has controlled himself to the final limit, and that limit has just broken. He rose from the bed so fast that Rosalie flinched, and Amelia immediately pulled the child into her arms to shield her by instinct. But Ashton didn't direct any of that force toward his daughter. He went to the door, pulled out his phone, and made 4 calls in the space of 30 seconds. The first was to the head of security. Lock every gate. No one goes out. No one comes in. If anyone violates that, shoot. The second was to the underboss in charge of security. Find Victor Hale. Hold him wherever he is. Don't let him leave the mansion. The third was to Thomas Mercer, and his voice was so cold Amelia could hear it from inside the room, through the open door. I need you to reopen the entire investigation into Colette's car accident. Get me the police report, the vehicle inspection report, the medical examiner's report. Everything. I want it on my desk within 24 hours. The fourth was to someone whose name Amelia didn't catch, but she heard Ashton say 1 sentence before ending the call. If Victor Hale steps off this property before I speak to him, you will answer for it with your life. He turned back toward Rosalie's door, and Amelia saw him stop at the threshold, close his eyes, take a breath, force the rage down once more, and then step back in, with his face under control again. He sat beside Rosalie, and the child, still in Amelia's arms, looked at her father with frightened eyes. But there was something else there, too. Hope. The small, fragile kind of hope a child carries when she believes that maybe, finally, the adults will do the right thing. Ashton held out his arms, and after 3 seconds of hesitation, Rosalie left Amelia's embrace and climbed into her father's, and Ashton held his daughter in the same arms that 20 minutes earlier had ordered men locked down and threatened other men with death, and he said in a voice only Rosalie and Amelia could hear, Papai is sorry, sweetheart. Papai didn't know, but now Papai knows, and no one will ever make you afraid again. Thomas Mercer delivered the investigation results to Ashton's desk, not in 24 hours, but in 18, because when Ashton Mercer gave an order in that tone, no one dared move slowly, and what lay inside the file Thomas placed on the walnut surface of the desk changed everything Ashton had believed to be true for the past 9 months. The vehicle inspection report had been re-examined from the ground up by an independent expert Thomas hired outside the system. Not a police expert, but an automotive engineer who had once worked for the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Agency, and the conclusion was written in cold, technical language. But Ashton read every word, as if he were reading a death sentence. The left front brake fluid line bore a clean cut, not natural wear, not damage from impact. The cut had been made with a sharp tool, possibly a pipe cutter or specialty pliers, at a point where the brake fluid would leak slowly over the course of 10 to 15 minutes of driving. Long enough for the car to leave the range of the mansion's security cameras, short enough for the brakes to fail completely while the car was moving at high speed on Lakeshore Drive. Colette Mercer hadn't died in an accident. Colette Mercer had been murdered. Ashton finished reading the report and sat motionless for 15 seconds. And Thomas, who had known the contents in advance, stood in the doorway without daring to move because he knew that silence was the most dangerous silence he had ever witnessed. Then Ashton turned to the second section of the file, the section Thomas had marked with a red tab. The GPS location data from Colette's phone on the day she died had been extracted from the police file, something no one had noticed the first time because the case had been classified as a simple traffic accident. The destination Colette had been driving toward wasn't a friend's house, wasn't a shopping center, wasn't any place a wealthy young mother would normally go on a Tuesday afternoon. Colette had been driving to the Chicago field office of the FBI on Roosevelt Road, and in the list of personal belongings recovered from the car after the crash, there was a black 16-gigabyte SanDisk USB drive that the police had logged but never examined because it wasn't considered relevant to the cause of the accident. That USB drive was no longer in the police evidence file. It had disappeared. Thomas added one more sentence before leaving the room. I checked Victor's private safe in his office at the mansion, with your authorization, and I found the USB drive. Inside it was the complete financial record of the Mercer Empire from 2010 until now. Double ledgers, laundering accounts in the Cayman Islands, fake invoices, money flows from arms trafficking, everything. Colette had prepared that evidence to hand over to the FBI in exchange for witness protection for herself and Rosalie. Victor found out and acted before she could get there. Ashton stood up, and Thomas stepped aside from the doorway, not out of courtesy but out of survival instinct, because the man walking past him was no longer Ashton Mercer the businessman, or Ashton Mercer the father, but Ashton Mercer, the head of a criminal empire who had just discovered that his right hand had murdered his wife. Victor Hale was being held in his private room on the second floor, with 2 guards outside the door, and when Ashton walked in, Victor was sitting in an armchair with the calm expression of a man who had been preparing for this moment for a long time. The 2 guards stepped out, the door closed, and in the room there remained only 2 men who had known each other for 18 years, one of them having just learned that the other had killed his wife. Ashton placed the file on the table between them. You cut Colette's brake line. Victor didn't deny it. He looked at the file, then looked at Ashton, and spoke in the same voice he had used for 18 years to advise, persuade, and steer. I saved your empire. Colette was on her way to hand everything over to the FBI. Everything. Everything your father built. Everything you built. Everything 3 generations of Mercers shed blood to build. She was going to send you to prison. Send your father to prison. Send the whole family to prison. Ashton stood 3 meters away from Victor, and Amelia would never know how much willpower it took him not to cross those 3 meters. You killed my wife. Victor exhaled with the air of a man explaining something obvious to someone too slow to understand. I killed the greatest threat your family ever faced. She stopped being your wife the moment she decided to betray this family. Silence for 5 seconds. Then Victor played his final piece. The piece he had kept in his hand for 9 months, like a spare bullet. And before you decide what to do with me, you should know one more thing. Your beloved nanny, Amelia Vance, daughter of James Vance, owner of that little grocery store on the south side. Victor smiled faintly, the smile of a man turning over his ace card. James Vance didn't die in a robbery. He was a witness in a case tied to the Mercer family's shipping operation, 21 years ago. He agreed to testify against us in court, and your father, Frank Mercer, gave the order to silence him. The 2 men who walked into that grocery store that night were sent by Frank. 3 shots. Case closed. Victor tilted his head and looked at Ashton. You think your nanny came here by accident? The daughter of a witness your father had killed suddenly appears in your house, caring for your daughter, gaining your daughter's trust, gaining your trust. Don't you smell revenge on her? Victor threw those words like a weapon with one clear purpose, to break Ashton's trust in Amelia, to make him suspect that she hadn't come to save Rosalie but to take revenge on the Mercer family, and if Ashton believed that, he would send Amelia away. Rosalie would fall back into silence, and Victor's secret would remain safe forever. But Victor had miscalculated. He had miscalculated because he had lived his entire life in a world where everyone had an angle, where kindness was always a mask and trust was always a trap. And he couldn't understand that there were people like Amelia Vance, people the world had beaten to pieces who still chose healing instead of revenge. Ashton looked at Victor for a very long time, and in his mind, instead of suspicion toward Amelia as Victor had hoped, another picture was forming, a picture in which everything fit together in the opposite direction. Victor killed Colette. Victor threatened Rosalie. Victor hired someone to dig through Amelia's past. Victor staged the family trial. Victor proposed to make sure she forgot. Every move Victor made had been aimed at one goal only, silencing the 5-year-old child who had begun to speak the truth because of the nanny from the south side, and now, when every one of those moves had failed, He hurled Amelia's past like a final grenade, hoping it would explode in the right place. It didn't explode. Ashton stepped closer to Victor, close enough for Victor to smell the shaving cream on his face, and said in a low voice that Amelia, if she had been there, wouldn't have recognized, because it wasn't the voice of the father, or the businessman, or the man sitting in the kitchen at 2 a.m. It was the voice of something Ashton Mercer had kept locked in a cage for years and had just set free. You killed my wife. You threatened my daughter. And now you want me to believe that the only woman who got my daughter to speak again is the enemy. You miscalculated, Victor. You miscalculated completely. Ashton found Amelia in the kitchen close to midnight, where she was sitting alone in the dark, in exactly the same way she had found him sitting there on that first night, and neither of them missed the echo of it, though neither said a word about it. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, with no table between them, no file, no non-disclosure agreement, only two people sitting less than a meter apart in the dark kitchen of a house where every secret was beginning to split open, like loose stitching on cloth. Amelia looked at his face and, for the first time since entering this house, she didn't see a Mafia boss, didn't see the helpless father, didn't see the cold man who wore his suits like armor. She saw a lost child, a child who had just discovered that the foundation beneath everything he trusted had been built on the bones of the dead, and who no longer knew where he was supposed to stand. I need to tell you something, Ashton said, and his voice was unlike any voice Amelia had heard from him before. Not cold, not controlled, not commanding, only bare and tired and afraid in the way this man had probably never allowed himself to be afraid in front of anyone. And you're going to hate me, then he told her. He told her about James Vance, the Southside grocery store owner, witness in the Mercer family shipping case 21 years earlier. He told her about Frank Mercer, his father, the man who gave the order to silence him. He told her about the 2 men who walked into the store that night and the 3 gunshots. He told her that Amelia Vance had been orphaned, that her mother had taken her own life, that she had been thrown into the foster care system, starved, beaten, her career destroyed, and that all of it, had begun with his father's decision in a room very much like this one many years ago. Amelia sat still the entire time Ashton spoke. She didn't interrupt, didn't cry, didn't let anything show on her face. She sat there with her hands resting in her lap and listened. And Ashton didn't know that the reason for her silence wasn't that she was processing the information, but that she was feeling 21 years of her life, arranging themselves in a line, each piece of pain that had once had no name now suddenly having an origin, every hungry night in a foster home now having an address to send it back to, every nightmare about her parents now carrying the name of the people responsible. And that name was Mercer. When Ashton finished, the silence stretched for 10 seconds, then 20, and he sat there looking at her with gray eyes from which every trace of steel had vanished, leaving behind something Amelia had never seen there before: shame. Amelia stood up. She rose slowly, like someone carrying an invisible weight across her shoulders, and she looked down at Ashton where he sat, and for the first time in their relationship, she stood higher than he did, not only physically. Your family killed my father. Her voice was flat, not trembling, not breaking, but every word landed with the weight of stone. My mother hanged herself because she couldn't survive losing him. I was 6 years old when I found her in the bathroom. I was orphaned, thrown into the system, starved, locked away, beaten, my career destroyed. I lost everything. All of it began with the bullet your family put into my father in that grocery store that night. Ashton opened his mouth and said, "Amelia," and she cut him off with 3 words as sharp as blades, each one spoken separately, each one given enough silence after it to stand alone. "Don't say my name." She turned her back and walked out of the kitchen, and Ashton didn't rise to follow her, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew he had no right. Amelia went up to the 3rd floor, walked down the hallway past the 7, turned over photographs of Colette, and she realized that now she understood why they had been turned down, not because Ashton couldn't bear to look at his wife, but because he couldn't bear to look at the woman he believed had died in an accident when the truth was that she had died trying to escape the empire he had built. She stopped in front of the door with the peeling butterfly stickers, opened it softly. Rosalie was asleep, curled up, but not rigid the way she had been that morning, her breathing even, her face peaceful. And Amelia realized that this might be the last time she ever saw that face. She stepped inside, picked up the lavender silk scarf that had slipped to the floor, placed it gently back into Rosalie's hand, and the child's fingers automatically closed around it, even in sleep, a reflex that 9 months of pain had turned into instinct. Amelia bent down and kissed Rosalie on the forehead, and her lips touched the child's warm, soft skin, and she whispered, "Emmy loves you, Rosalie, always." Then she straightened up, walked out, closed the door behind her, went down the stairs, crossed the black Marquina marble hall, passed beneath the Baccarat chandelier, past the Francis Bacon painting, past Nina standing in the kitchen doorway watching her go without saying a word because she understood, past the 2 guards at the gate who opened the door for her without asking anything, and her glue-patched sneakers made one last faint squeak on the stone path leading back to the iron gate, and this time that squeak didn't say, "You don't belong here anymore." It said something far more painful. It said, "You do belong here. But this place killed your family." The iron gate closed behind her with the same low metallic groan it had made the first time it opened, and Amelia Vance stepped alone into the Chicago night, back toward the south side, back toward the studio apartment with the eviction notice taped to the door and $14 in her account. But this time she carried something she hadn't had when she came, the truth about her father, and that truth was heavier than any debt. 3 weeks after the night Amelia walked out through the iron gate, Ashton Mercer had destroyed half the empire that 3 generations of his family had built. Thomas Mercer drafted a cooperation agreement with the Chicago field office of the FBI in 7 days, an agreement Thomas said was the craziest thing he had ever written in his career as a lawyer. But he wrote it because when Ashton gave an order, Thomas didn't ask why. The terms of the agreement were these. Victor Hale would plead guilty to first-degree murder in the killing of Colette Mercer, plead guilty to extortion and to threatening a child, and in exchange, the FBI would prosecute Victor personally and would not expand the investigation to the entire Mercer organization, on the condition that Ashton committed to fully legalizing all business operations within 3 years, closing every account in the Cayman Islands, shutting down the weapons pipeline, moving all money through legitimate banking channels, and providing limited cooperation to the FBI in cases involving former partners. Victor was arrested inside the mansion, handcuffed by 2 federal agents in front of Ashton, and as he was led across the black Marquina marble hall, he looked at Ashton one last time and said, "You'll regret this. You're killing your family." And Ashton answered with only one sentence, "You killed my family first." The next day, Ashton called Frank in Palm Beach by video. He didn't make small talk, didn't ask about his health, didn't ease into it. "Father, 21 years ago you ordered the killing of James Vance, the Southside grocery store owner, the witness in the shipping case." Frank was silent for 5 seconds on the screen, his 72-year-old face unmoving, and Ashton wondered whether he would deny it, but Frank didn't deny it. "I know," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "I knew you'd ask from the moment Victor was arrested." "You killed an innocent man," Ashton said, and his voice wasn't angry. It was something heavier than anger. The disappointment of a son, realizing that the father he had admired all his life was not the man he had believed him to be. He had a wife. He had a 6-year-old daughter. His daughter grew up in foster care, was starved, beaten, destroyed, lost everything. Because of us, Father, because of this family. Frank Mercer, 72 years old, closed his eyes on the screen, and when he opened them again, Ashton saw something he had never seen in his life before. Tears on his father's face. Not one tear, but streams of water running down the deep lines beside his nose and along his chin. And the old man didn't wipe them away, didn't hide them. He just sat there and cried in front of his son for the first time in 72 years. "I justified it to myself for 21 years. Frank said through broken breaths that it was war, that he was going to send us to prison, that I had no choice. But I did have a choice. I always had a choice." Ashton ended the video call without saying anything more, and he sat alone in his study for a long time, staring at the chair where Amelia had sat the night she told him about her past, the chair by which he had stood up and poured her a glass of water. And he thought about how she had sat there, telling him about her father being murdered and her mother taking her own life, without knowing that the man sitting across from her was the son of the one who gave the order, and she had still trusted him enough to tell him, and that realization made him feel something that every fine and every year in prison weighed less than shame. Meanwhile, Rosalie regressed violently, not slowly, but with collapse, like a building losing its support columns. She stopped eating the very day Amelia left, stopped speaking that same night, and curled back into the corner of the bed, clutching the lavender scarf, which now carried something new as well, the faint scent of Amelia's perfume from the kiss on her forehead that last night. Nina reported to Ashton every day. She didn't eat breakfast. She didn't eat lunch. She didn't speak. She only lay curled into herself, and every night Nina heard Rosalie say one word in her sleep, over and over, Emmy, Emmy, Emmy. On the 21st day, Ashton drove to the south side. Not in the armored Bentley he usually used, but in the most ordinary car in the garage, the old Ford the maintenance staff used. No bodyguards, no driver. No one knew where he was going. He parked in front of the apartment building where Amelia lived. A building with peeling paint on the walls and a stairwell that smelled of dampness and flickering hallway lights. And Ashton Mercer, the man who owned a mansion on Astor Street and a penthouse on the Magnificent Mile, stood in the dark hallway on the 4th floor of the poorest building on the south side and knocked on the door of a studio apartment whose rent cost 1% of his household electricity bill. Amelia opened the door. She looked different from 3 weeks earlier. Thinner, dark circles under her eyes. But the look she gave him wasn't hatred. It was something worse than hatred. It was the exhaustion of someone who no longer had the energy left to hate. Before she could close the door, Ashton said, Rosalie stopped eating. She stopped talking. She says your name in her sleep every night. Amelia kept her hand on the door, not opening it wider, not closing it either. I didn't come here to ask you to forgive my family, Ashton said, and his voice, the voice Amelia had heard order men killed and order the mansion locked down, was trembling now, truly trembling. I came here to beg. For the first time in my life, Victor has been arrested. My father admitted what he did. I am dismantling every illegal operation, and I have established a scholarship fund in your father's name, the James Vance Memorial Scholarship, $200,000 for orphaned children who want to study psychology. Amelia looked at him through the narrow opening of the door, and her eyes were red around the edges, but no tears fell because she had cried enough in the past 3 weeks. Money won't bring my father back. I know, Ashton said. Nothing in this world will, but I can spend the rest of my life making sure that no child ever loses their parents because of my family again. Never again. The silence between them lasted a very long time. 2 people on opposite sides of the half-open door of a crumbling studio apartment on the south side of Chicago, and in that silence Amelia heard Rosalie's voice in her head. Don't go. Everyone always goes. And she realized that she had made a promise. She had told that child that Emmy wasn't going anywhere, and Amelia Vance might lose everything else in her life, but she did not break promises, because her grandmother had never once broken a promise to her on those Saturdays for 2 years, and that was the reason she was still alive. Amelia returned to the Astor Street mansion on the 23rd day, not because she had forgiven Ashton, not because she had forgiven Frank, not because of the $200,000 scholarship fund or the promise to legalize the empire, but because in her mind Rosalie's voice kept echoing every night as she lay on the narrow bed in her studio on the south side. Don't go. Everyone always goes. And Amelia Vance had made a promise, and she didn't break promises, because the only person who had ever taught her the meaning of a promise was her grandmother, the woman who came to see her every Saturday for 2 years without missing once until she opened her mouth and spoke again. When Amelia stepped through the iron gate for the second time, her glue-patched sneakers still squeaked against the stone floor. The guards still nodded without words, and Nina opened the door with wet eyes she tried to hide by turning away too quickly. Amelia went straight to the 3rd floor, opened Rosalie's bedroom door, and the little girl was lying curled in the corner of the bed, clutching the lavender scarf. But when she heard footsteps, she opened her eyes, and when she saw Amelia standing in the doorway, that tiny face, thinner than it had been 3 weeks earlier, broke into the first smile she had shown since Amelia left, a smile that wasn't large but was real. Real enough to light the whole room that had been dark for 3 weeks. And Rosalie said in a hoarse voice, but clearly, Emmy didn't disappear. Amelia sat down beside the bed and pulled Rosalie into her arms, and the child clung to her with the full strength of her thin 5-year-old body. And she said, No, Emmy didn't disappear. Emmy is here, and this time I'm not going anywhere. But Amelia kept her distance from Ashton, not coldly, but clearly, not with hatred, but with boundaries. She was here for Rosalie, and only for Rosalie. And Ashton understood that, so he didn't push, didn't pursue, didn't say the things she wasn't ready to hear. Instead, he acted. He came home at 6 in the evening every day, instead of 11 at night. He sat at dinner with Rosalie and Amelia in the 3 chairs pushed close together at the end of the 12-seat table, without asking for anything more. He hired an architect to rebuild James Vance's old grocery store on the south side into a support center for orphaned children. And he didn't put the Mercer name anywhere on the building, only James Vance Community Center in large letters across the front. He flew to Palm Beach once a month to sit with Frank, not to forgive him, but to force the 72-year-old man to write apology letters to the family of every person the Mercer organization had harmed, and Frank wrote them, every letter by hand with trembling fingers on white paper. Every letter an apology he hadn't been brave enough to write 21 years earlier. Amelia saw all of it and said nothing, but she saw it. And over time, the distance between her and Ashton at the dinner table began to shrink. Not in centimeters, but in the way her eyes stayed on his a second longer, in the way she no longer left the room when he entered, in the way that sometimes, very rarely, she allowed herself a small smile when he said something clumsy to make Rosalie laugh. 1 year later, Rosalie was 6 years old, speaking normally, eating normally, beginning 1st grade at the private elementary school on Division Street, and on her first day of school, she carried the lunchbox she and Amelia had prepared together that morning. And inside were butterfly-shaped sandwiches, and a little note Amelia had written, "Princess Butterfly is flying to school today, and she will be very brave." Dr. Raymond Walsh, the leading psychologist for the Mercer family, who had originally doubted Amelia's method, now invited her to co-author a paper with him on the treatment of selective mutism in traumatized children through behavioral food therapy, and the paper was published in the American Journal of Child Psychology, with Amelia Vance's name listed first. Their first kiss happened exactly 1 year after Amelia returned, in the kitchen, late at night. Exactly like the first night they had met there when Ashton had been drinking whiskey in the dark, and Amelia told him he shouldn't drink alone. But this time there was no whiskey, no darkness, only Ashton washing dishes, because Amelia had cooked dinner that night, and he had insisted on washing up. And when she handed him the last plate, their hands touched for the second time since the rainy night of Rosalie's nightmare. And this time neither of them pulled away, and Ashton looked at her and said in a low voice, "I've never deserved you." And Amelia said, "No one deserves or doesn't deserve anyone. There are only people who choose to become better each day." And he kissed her, gently, slowly, as if afraid she might break. And she didn't break, because she had been broken too many times already, and had learned how to mend herself stronger than before. 3 years later, Amelia Mercer, 30 years old, opened a free child psychology clinic on the south side of Chicago, inside the James Vance Community Center, funded by the Mercer Foundation. And in its first year, the clinic received more than 300 traumatized children from across the city. Rosalie was 8 years old, tall, healthy, her blonde hair tied in a ponytail, talking like a running stream, eating everything, cooking every weekend with Amelia, and at school when a classmate named Lily refused to eat lunch because she was afraid of food after her parents' divorce, Rosalie sat beside her and said, "Let me tell you the story of Princess Butterfly, okay? The princess finds food with magical power everywhere she flies," and Lily finished her lunch that day. Ashton completed the legalization of the empire exactly on schedule after 3 years. Mercer Holdings was now a completely clean real estate and hotel corporation. The FBI closed its 15-year surveillance file, and Ashton told Amelia that it was the best deal he had ever made, because for the first time in his life, he didn't have to look over his shoulder to see who was watching. Frank died peacefully in Palm Beach at the age of 75, in his sleep. After finishing the final apology letter to the family of the last person on the list he had ever harmed, and on the bedside table beside him was a photograph of Rosalie smiling that Ashton had sent, and on the back was a handwritten line from Amelia. "Grandpa Frank, I forgive you, because forgiveness is the only way I can be free." 5 years later, Amelia was invited to speak at Harvard University on the subject "When Love Becomes Therapy in Traumatized Child Psychology," and when a doctor in the audience asked her what she considered the most important thing in healing traumatized children, Amelia said, "Believe them. Children know immediately when they are truly loved and when they are only being pitied. And the difference between those two things decides whether they live or die." That night in her hotel room in Boston, Amelia received a message from Rosalie, 10 years old, typing on the iPad Ashton had given her for her birthday. "Mom, Emmy, I cooked pasta for the whole family tonight. Daddy said it's better than any restaurant. I love you, Mom. I love Daddy. I love the Butterfly Princess." Amelia read the message 3 times, then she cried. Not the kind of crying she had known for 21 years. The kind that comes from loss, from hunger, from beatings, from abandonment, from finding her mother in the bathroom. This was a kind of crying she had never known before. The kind that comes entirely, completely, only from happiness. The kind of happiness so pure that the body doesn't know any other way to express it except through tears. There are 2 kinds of healing in this world. The first kind erases pain, and it is necessary. It helps people survive through today. But the second kind is much rarer and much more powerful. The kind that turns pain into purpose, turns wounds into a map for saving others, turns the darkness you have walked through into a lamp for the people still lost inside it. Amelia Vance lost her parents at 6 and nearly died inside the system society built to protect her. Rosalie Mercer lost her mother at 4 and nearly died inside the house her father built to protect her. 2 little girls separated by 21 years. But the same pain, the same silence, the same hunger, and the same miracle. Not the miracle of money or power or expensive medicine, but the simplest miracle in the world. One person who sits beside you patiently and says, "I'm not going anywhere," and truly doesn't go. This story isn't a fairy tale. There are millions of children in this world who are silent because they are afraid, who refuse to eat because they are hurting, who curl into the corner of a bed, holding something that belonged to the person they lost, and they don't need magic. They only need one person who believes they deserve to be loved. That person might be you. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button to support the channel. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our new stories every day. We would truly love to know how you felt about Amelia and Rosalie's story, which part moved you the most, and what this story made you think about in your own real life. Please share in the comments below. We read every comment, and always want to hear what lives deep inside each person's heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace in each day. And if you are going through a hard season, please remember that there is always someone willing to sit beside you and wait, just as Amelia's grandmother waited, just as Amelia waited for Rosalie. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.